Hello, everybody. Welcome. So grateful to have this time together while we are all still alive here on Earth. A planet that I profoundly adore and deeply believe in the beingness of. The idea that Earth is a being is probably both very old and also not as universal as we might imagine. Well, it's hawk time here. Hawk high in the sky, circling, and another one or two, one in a tree being harassed by a Steller's jay, in an example of an ancient symbiosis, not merely enmity. The hawk is not merely the enemy of the corvid, because they inform each other's intelligences and developmental arcs, evolutionary arcs, right? What may superficially appear to be enmity or competition, is never merely the one valued delusion that language and modern human culture are likely to presume, suppose, impose on our thought through various games in language and so forth. In fact, all relationships and all subjects of nomenclature, all they called, it'll come to me, all nominata, right? Nominata are those things toward which language points our attention, concern, or capacity to distinguish. And that English part has a lot in common with the idea of extinguishing. And what gets extinguished? The unity and the infinite valued situation that we find ourselves in when considering in consciousness the identities or properties or qualities of beings, circumstances, and relationships. We should learn and remind each other to be extremely suspicious of any one valued kind of polemic or dialectic. The idea that that is a tree and that is only a tree is ridiculous, insulting, stupidifying.
There's a Thai restaurant right here.
The woman was saying, where we're going, you have a choice. And then she began to enumerate the different restaurants. But notice how she said, I noticed how she said, you have a choice, the singular. You have a choice. As if, you either have a choice or no choice. And so if you don't have no choices, you have a choice. And this is one of the common debilitating identity games that underlie English and that get imported into consciousness, smuggled in when we learn English in the milieu of native speakers of this language, which is not merely colonial and colonizing, yet has these qualities and histories associated with it. So back to the earth as a being. You know, some indigenous, for example, indigenous cultures do not see the earth as a being. And it's not clear which cultures were aware of the idea of a planet at all, and when this idea may have arisen in any culture we may direct our attention towards. It does seem... Oh, multi-bird goose attack. The male is angry. The neck is all craned over and he's ready to do the "I'm gonna bite you" bit to the other birds. And this one appears to have possibly suffered some kind of a neck attack, but maybe not. So, you know, we have these weird ideas, and they seem entirely ordinary to us, at least since Galileo. The idea that this is a solar system in a galaxy, in a universe, that space is mostly empty, that planets are objects, not beings, when in fact, more than likely, almost certainly, the planets are not merely not inert, and they are not merely beings. They are perhaps, and I think it's very likely, they are transcendental forms, of which the physical aspect is the minimal component of the form, much like humans and what we think of as souls or our spirits. You know, as a regular everyday human being, your body seems to be what you are. You are your body. And so you experience threats to your body as if they are threats to you fundamentally, because you don't have an experience, maybe you don't have an experience, of being, but not being your body. I remember seeing a cartoon yesterday of someone sitting up in bed, and the cartoon was entitled "In the Body Experience" instead of "out of body," "in of body experience." But you know, many of us have had the experience of being outside our body, of having our perspective and perception located in space distinctly from where our body is. Very common that this turns out, relatively common, that this turns out to be the upper left-hand corner of the room, as it might be perceived relational to our body. And that upper left thing is kind of interesting because it implies right hemispheric stuff going on. Now, some people will say, particularly materialists, physicalists, especially eliminative materialists, that that's just an illusion. But such people will also say that the mind with which they are forming that conclusion is illusory, not understanding that their argument undermines their argument. If your mind is merely an illusion, and if illusions are that which is not real or does not correspond to reality in some way, is not veridical, then there's no reason to impose validity on any assertion that can be made by such a mind, including the assertion that the mind is illusory, or consciousness is illusory, or an epiphenomenon of brain function, or etc., etc., etc. Many ridiculous arguments suffer from declarative self-inclusion, where if the argument is taken seriously, it naturally undermines itself according to the principles of set theory, because by including its origin in the proclamation, i.e., minds are just an illusion, well, the thing that you're making the statement with and the thing you're interpreting the statement with, not to mention the thing that causes you to believe the statement to be valid, you've just rendered all of these untrustworthy in a fundamental way. So, I can imagine, to go back to the Earth as a being thing, it's not clear who knew ideas about planets and stars and so forth, and when some people or group or culture or cohort knew these things in terms of the developmental history of our species. Everyone probably had an idea of home. Like, this is the this is the world, right? Quote unquote, but that didn't necessarily mean a planet. And this is our world, right? The territory between these 3 mountains and those 2 rivers, for example, inclusive of this, that, and the other thing. This is our home. And, most of the humans thought, it seems, many of them anyway, that they were the original people. So we are not a people, and the article matters here. We are the people. We are the people. And this is clear from anthropological research, which is not always accurate and is often misconstrued by those researchers that compose the perspectives and write about them for academic purposes and so forth. These matters are very murky. What is a world? Did they understand planets? It seems very clear that people like the Dogon, who appear to have had contact with some form of non-human intelligence, were aware that there are planets and that this is a planet, and there were stars, and that a particular star was the home of sky people. And they knew essentially impossible things about that star. For example, they knew, I believe, that it was a binary, which is impossible to detect without, really advanced mathematical knowledge and telescopes and things. They knew that the star had a planet, which is impossible to detect, I think. So there were ancient peoples who might have been aware of the idea of a planet, but what it meant to them is very difficult to understand, and it seems impossible that it could have meant what we think of as a planet. In fact, it's similarly impossible that they would imagine space or space-time in the abstract way we do, thinking of it, for example, as a vacuum populated by a variety of celestial objects. I.e. things, right? So we don't, it's very, we'd have to go sort of people by people and time by time to gain any reasonable understanding. And even then it would be difficult, especially if there were no written records. We would only have their traditional knowledge to depend on, which in some cases is relatively reliable and a few thousand years old, and in other cases is not very reliable, and in some other cases is much older, 20,000 years old. So it would be very difficult to understand what they thought about stars and planets and it's probably not true that they were animists in the senses that we think about animism. Because for us, animism is a weird thing. It's like you get rid of the qualities of being in beings and situations and circumstances and so forth. You throw that all away, and you re-add it, in a sort of panpsychic gesture, right? So because we start out from the abstract and we would like re-add it, it would be impossible for these elder peoples to have thought abstractly about beings, places, right? Mountains were not necessarily gods, but in nearly no case was it possible that they didn't have at least the status of beings, and probably the status of something we don't have a category for. And this is the category that I use the word transcendence to point at. It is more than a being, it is a progenitor of beings. Without this, there is no beings. Without this, there are no minds. The sun and the world clearly belong to this class. We don't really have... The only category we really have in English that points this way, that nominates the sun and the moon and the earth to such a status would be God, a God, right? And so we have these weird ideas of like Gaia and stuff. But these ideas mostly only come to us not necessarily from ancient peoples, from modern anthropologists painting things onto perspectives they were exposed to in living with and communicating with older peoples, indigenous peoples, and so forth. And so it's very difficult for us moderns, especially those of us who speak English and don't speak an indigenous language. That duck tried to eat the butterfly. That's hilarious. I don't know why that's hilarious. I just find it hilarious. It's not innately hilarious. It just reminds me of certain comic strips. So yeah, we unfortunately we learn about a world of things through the language that we speak. And initially these things are deprived of beingness, of originness, of unitarity, of ultimacy, right? Ultimacy, meaning not merely ordinary, not a thing, can't be a thing, unthingness. Prioritized above all language concepts and so forth, ultimacy. Okay? And unitarity, meaning not a separate subject of discernment or distinguishing, but rather an instance of the entire history and future of everything. An instance. I think Alan Watts once said something resembling, in the same way an apple tree could be said to verb, right? It apples, right? Meaning the constant production of and appling of the tree. In the same way the apple tree apples, the world persons, right? The world just produces these myriad forms of beings, including apple trees, as an expression of its own nature, history, origin, purposive expression, and so forth. So what is the world? Well, it's not a what. One way to answer the question is, or one way to respond to the question is, without the world, isings, right? Isises don't exist. There are no isings. And isings are being as this moment, present beingness, the doing of being by beings. Clearly the waterfowl agree with me. I think it's very obvious. They're like, yes, of course this is so. But the world is the precursor to the possibility of things like beings and minds and relationships and circumstances and so forth. And it's also the peculiar stage for what we refer to with the word consciousness, without very well understanding what that might mean or what we mean by that, unless we suppose, see, this is the problem. In English, these things are additive. It is as if when we say you are conscious, we are adding a property to a container, when nothing like that is even possibly going on except in language. There's no chance that language is the possession of a container. No chance. If anything, it's the natural expression of communal origination, futurity, relation, in and as a localized exemplar of transcendent hypersystems that produce things like time, space, galaxies, stars, black holes, white holes, quasars, pulsars, nebula, moons, the Kuiper belt, ice chunks, comets, meteors, all of these celestial beings. Yeah? So these are exemplars of an originary pulse that we refer to often as the primary miracle in science, in cosmology, scientific cosmology. The miracle we call as if there's only one, Big Bang. which implies some kind of, just got soaked. Well, I got wet, actually, not soaked. I don't know, for those of us puriently minded, it implies that something was having it on with something else and then it blew up. And then stars and, time, space and all that comes out of the exgasm. Yeah, that's the give me one miracle branch of cosmology. Give me one miracle and I'll explain everything else. The thing about science, though, is that it's not fundamentally explanatory. It's fundamentally utilitarian for most human purposes. There are exceptions. And by utilitarian, I mean it forges theories, puts those theories in combat against each other in a kind of rock, paper, scissors thing. And then the ones that win propagate, and then we make machines to both test and implement physical observations. And mostly, like, physics is a lot about prediction, right? What happens next, given X, Y, and Z, and some other variables? What do they tell me how the system will evolve? And the better your story about how it evolves, the more accurate we presume the theory to be. But I'm not really here to talk about that. So what is the world? Well, again, the question's kind of ridiculous, because without the world, there are no questions, right? So one of the things that is around here and for us is the moment-to-moment origin of the possibility of purposeful thought, relation, conception, nomenclature, theories, and so forth. You can see that it doesn't fit inside the category tree because the category tree doesn't exist without it. It's very similar with the sun. Just take that thing away, poof, right? All human thought, history, experience, religion, math, science, art, insanity, war, everything, gone. Poof, gone. Meaningless. So, obviously the sun must be held in an extremely specialized perspective, categorically, where it's an exemplar of supercategory, beyond categories. Because without it, you don't get minds. And without minds, categories don't matter anymore. So this is why I think stars and planets and moons and things are transcendental. And I tend to concern myself somewhat with what that means and how to better understand it, even conceptually. But the idea for me is that the idea that I usually play with here, I can play with others, is that one must preserve, much like Gödelian incompleteness in mathematical systems. Just got wet again. One must preserve the supracategorical character, necessity of transcendentals that by their existence create the possibility of thought. We mustn't subsume those into the conceptual systems in an ordinary fashion, especially if we are concerned about the verity of our rationales. Right? rational meaning to make parts of, to both distinguish and connect, to denote and connotate these distinguishings and connections. Of course, the connotation thing is more like dreaming than logic. The denotation thing is more like logic than dreaming. So, for me, also what I wanted to say is that for some indigenous peoples, the sun and the earth were well known to be beings. For example, I suspect this is what my friend Ryan Firstdiver, who I strongly recommend you look up his YouTube channel. Brilliant, one of the last remaining Blackfoot beaver men, one of my closest friends, and one of my favorite teachers. And by the way, don't be fooled by Ryan's external cultural costume. He may listen to rap music and scrap with the superficial culture and its icons and so forth. Inside that human being is a profoundly deep intelligence, a brilliant writer, one of the most heartful people I've ever known. Again, looks tough on the outside, soft as soft can be in his heart. Loves the animals, the living places, honors the old agreements to the best of his ability, rescues the animals from the humans. Very much a heroic being, in my view. Orion, I think, would say that although the sun and the moon are understood in Blackfoot traditional culture as sky persons or something like this, persons of the sky, as are the morning star and the companion star, the false morning star, which is we call Jupiter. Though those are sky people, and they were here once. They've come down to the earth, and they still come down to the earth to visit and communicate and transact with humans who get their attention. And there are various ways to acquire their attention, which is also a fairly dangerous thing, project to undertake. But although they are the sky people, the earth is like the hogan, right? Or not necessarily the teepee, but like the communal home of the sun and the moon, where perhaps, this is my own addition, don't quote me on this, their children live, perhaps. And there are old stories where they were here together on the earth. They had children, I believe 7 particularly, which would be hard to not imagine corresponds to the planets. All of those beings lived here. In the traditional story, the moon takes a lover. The sun becomes incensed. Ha ha! What a pun at this, because the sun can smell the lover around the house, and then there's a huge fight. The moon goes insane and becomes a sort of like a banshee-like monster that is chasing them, and the sun gives each of the children a pouch in which there is a power of protection, and the moon hunts them. This is a very abbreviated version of the story. Eventually, there's a sort of denouement, I think, a climax where the son or one of the children, I can't remember, cuts off one of the moon's legs, and the moon bleeds, and then the moon goes up into the sky, and this is a explanatory figure, literary figure, or ceremonial, traditional story figure that explains the moon's cycling, right? What's going on is that the leg is being cut off and then regrown over the lunar cycle. Then, of course, they all go back up into the sky. Now, the thing that is clear is that those planets are not objects, and the moon is not an object. It's unclear what category they belong to. It isn't God's, but it's certainly both inclusive of humanity and transcendental to it at the same time. As I understand from Ryan, the Blackfoot people generally, traditionally, do not believe in the idea of the transmigration of souls or the existence of souls. There is sort of such a thing as a ghost, in a way, but it's not the same concept. And in fact, the whole foundation of categories and concepts in Blackfoot is fundamentally different, and one might even say, in a sense, not translatable to the Western templates of identity, abstraction, function, role, circumstance, situation, relationship, and so forth. For one thing, it seems to me from what I've learned that, and I'm happy to be corrected about any of this, by the way. I'm not an expert on any of these matters. I've just been lucky enough. I'm like a kid who got some mud splashed on him, right? And I'm like, oh, this mud is very interesting, but I don't really know. I didn't grow up in the mud, so to speak. But like identity is rarely explicit in Blackfoot traditional culture because we don't know moment to moment whether the appearance of someone or something is the most important feature to attend. So I may see someone coming from far off, there is a being, I might say. As they get closer, I may see certain signs that they belong to a specific people or place. They are a blood tribe man appearing on a horse, appearing, right? But that's not necessarily that I know it's a blood tribe man. All I know is that there are signs that it's a blood tribe man. Because that could be the sun. That could be anyone. It depends sort of on who they come from. Like, who is being represented by the being who is coming. And as they approach closer and closer, there are different linguistic forms to treat with the situation. As we get closer to something resembling denotative identity. This is indeed, the man whose indigenous name is thus and such, or the woman whose indigenous name is thus and such. And it is indeed that she represents, her people and her tribe and herself. But it's possible for there to be lots of other outcomes, and this is something that in English is just not understood. When we see Joe, we think, oh, that's Joe, end of story. Which really almost can't be true, because there's so many phase states of Joe, and so many purposes for which Joe might be here, or not here, or arriving, or departing, or all of these things, that we don't pay much attention to in terms of identity in English, and we should, because they are crucial features of understanding role, identity, relationship, origin, future, futurity, ultimacy, all of these things, right? You know, I heard a story that was claimed, and you know, once again, it's not my goal here to say, oh, this is a true story, or this is not a true story. What I am saying here is that in the sense of theoria, a useful story, a useful perspective, this perspective is useful. I heard a story where a man claimed to have been working at a secret government installation. He had disguised his voice to tell this story. I have also heard that this story was somehow debunked. I don't care. I don't care because I'm not trying to tell the truth. I'm trying to illumine a perspective that I think is important and useful. So in this story, it was claimed that each of the planets that we know of, that we exist in a specific layer of a multi-layered reality. And in our layer, the Earth is the primarily inhabited planet, the biorelational hyperstructure in the solar system. It was not clear whether the other planets presently have life or not, but it was claimed that there's a layer in which every planet in the solar system is inhabited. And from this one, it looks like Earth is the only one. There are layers in which the Earth is not inhabited, and another planet is inhabited, or another couple of planets are inhabited, and not necessarily by life as we suppose it must exist. And this is a very interesting story because I had been shown something similar to this, a perspective in which what looks like craters on worlds in this layer are actually cities in other layers. Now this is very science fiction-y, and I'm not trying to claim it's true. I'm claiming that it's a useful perspective to entertain in consciousness. Why is it useful? Well, it draws into question the strange, unjustifiable certainties that are imposed upon us. Oh, that's really interesting. I was wondering what is underneath these radish plants, and what is underneath them are roots, not radishes. You know, think about the difference between, think that you haven't seen people gardening or growing food, right? And you come across some plants, and you look at the surface of the plant, and you see the leaves and the stems and things. And you think, well, that doesn't look edible. Well, you're probably right. It's not particularly edible and or nutritious. But then, under the ground, where you are not looking yet, there are radishes and potatoes and carrots and things. And it is similar in reality, right? The superficial appearances and the expectations imposed on us in English are not indicative of the character of nature or origin or reality, whatever reality might mean. And that also presumes that, I am disinclined personally to believe that observation causes wave collapse and other seemingly ridiculous to me stories. I just don't believe it. I think something's going on, and something probably very fascinating is going on, but it isn't that. I certainly also don't believe that if I turn away from a tree and I'm not observing it directly, it's not there. No, there's no chance that that's going on, as far as I'm concerned. I'm willing to entertain the idea in discussion and so forth, of course. But do I think it's a reasonable or rational idea? Hell no. I have friends that think when you stop looking at things, they're not there anymore. And I'm like, well, that's kind of a problem, because that would mean that you're a highly privileged observer. It would mean that your cells aren't observers simply because they don't have eyes. So your cells can't tell that the oven behind you is now missing from reality. And none of the insects or other animals or plants qualify as observers. This is the problem I have with, like, if a tree falls in the forest, where there's no one there to hear it, doesn't make sound. Forest is filled with living beings. Well, maybe the human concept of, sound, if there's no humans there, it's unreasonable to say that the human concept of sound pertains to what then occurs. But forest is filled with living beings, and I'm pretty sure they experience vibrations in the air, and many of them have actual ears, and all of them have cells that can detect vibration, and some of them have specialized structures like antennae and things like this that can detect all kinds of things, probably. So the idea that the human is the ultimately privileged observer that causes wave collapse, it's fucking insane. I just don't believe it. And, convince me, right? If you want to have an argument about this, my one friend Sebastian, I know, wants to argue about this with me. By all means, let's have an argument and we'll debate the problem. I think, again, you have the same problem as you have with statements that encompass their own origin. Here, there's some kind of a recursion problem in this argument that I can find, but I need someone to make a relatively clear claim that I can then refute first. I could do it myself, but that would be tedious and reminiscent of onanism, intellectual onanism. So, what are the what is time space? Well, almost all this is a question that I've been in love with for a long, long time. When ancient people looked at the sky, what did they experience? What did they think that was, if they thought it was something? And, I would argue that probably they were far less conceptual than we are. So it's not like they're trying to think, what is that? That's very conceptual. Rather, they are probably having an experience more like diving into water, where suddenly when you look up at the night sky, the universe changes. You change. Everything changes. And you are aware, in a participatory sense, of the nature of the sky, of its status as ultimate I can't make this word. I can't make this tense of the word. Progenerative, right? It is that from which all things derive their being. Parental or hyperparental. Filial, this is my family. And these are not thoughts. They are experienced viscerally, emotionally, cognitively, in a way not dissimilar to what happens when we dream, right? The one thing you're not really doing much of when you're dreaming, otherwise you're either going to wake up or become lucid, is thinking. You're experiencing the relationships, the situations, the exchanges, and so forth, the transformations. You're not thinking about them. If you start thinking about them, you're going to wake up. And if you think about them very gently, you will then realize you are dreaming. as I did the other night when I found myself in my dead father's garage, and I knew that this was impossible because the house has been sold, and those objects that I were seeing had all been disposed of. I knew, like, okay, right now I'm seeing something that it can't be true. It can't be there. I'm definitely not seeing what I'm actually, where I am, right? And so what I suspect very strongly, and I think that this experience is directly accessible to us, is that when the ancients looked at the sky, it was a bit like diving into the water of originary transcendence. And this is why they revered it.
I live in two nice hotels and one cafe. You know, he knows everywhere.
I love it when I see I mean, I guess I just love being itself, but I love the animated, when I see animated, enthusiastic conversation among human companions. So yeah, I think when they looked up, they left the world. They had a participatory experience of a transcendental kind of a living water, right? And it wasn't an accident that they likened the sky to an ocean. That wasn't superstition. It's true. If you just go upscale, one scale, like one ladder rung from the world, the sky is transcendental. It is like water. It's filled with islands. There are stars. There are planets. But you don't have to know anything abstract at all. You don't have to know those are stars and planets. You don't need any of that. You can actually just dive into the water. And I've had experiences that border on this when I was very young and I looked up at the sky before I had been trained to think abstractly about what up means, what is up, what the sky is, what space is, what planets and stars are, what stellar, like celestial phenomena are. I'm watching a turtle swimming in a pond with some carp that they're all sunning themselves in the heat of the day. And I strongly suspect that space-time is much more like this lake than a void populated with objects. Right? It is a transcendental medium populated with transcendental phenomena. And in case you don't believe me, just take a look at the photographs of that stuff. Take a look at Jupiter. Does that look like an ordinary thing to you? Take a look at the Starbirth Nebula, right? Or the Crab Nebula, or the Butterfly Nebula, or a quasar, or a pulsar. You think those are ordinary material phenomena? Really? Where'd you get that idea? Because they sure don't look that way to me, and neither does the moon, nor the sun. I admit that the moon looks desert-like and bereft of what we would think of as vitalistic phenomena. It kind of looks like, what it actually reminds me of is something like the idea of the extremely elder, brilliant, rich crone. But I definitely do think of the moon as feminine and the sun as masculine. I'm capable of inverting those perspectives. And I know that, there are cohorts of moderns who would want to take me to task for thinking that there's anything like binary gender. Be my guest. Let's have at it. I'm gonna stay on the side of binary gender. And beyond that, again, this isn't one thing mind, because I don't think there's merely binary gender. I just think that conceptually, symbolically, and metaphysically, the concept of binary gender is crucially important and not to be disposed of for political or ideological purposes. Expanded? Sure. and possibly even contradicted for specific purposes. But yeah, I want, in my cosmology, binary gender is actual. It's not the only game in town, but it's real enough. And again,
2,
in
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
all right, somebody's counting and it's fucking up my mind. We can have a number of different templates, but I'm not going to dispose of the one that seems to me foundational. And in Blackfoot, I would be surprised if the concept of gender is merely binary. I did have some discussions with Ryan about this a long time ago. I think there's an essay on my Medium page regarding this. But it's not my goal to explore that particular topic here. Rather, I'm trying to say something about the character my experience of the character and influence and profundity and perhaps even fecundity of the moon, which I do think of as feminine, and I also think of the earth as feminine. And if you ask me, like, well, why would you do that? Because the earth appears to generate children. Yeah, and in my private cosmology, which I'm not trying to convince anyone of, right? I'm not asking anyone else to believe or think the same way I do about these topics. If it's useful, entertain it. If it's not, do as you will. Yeah, the Earth generates. Okay, so the Earth is sort of, in my weird cosmology, an ever-virginal mother that generates infinite kinds of children. By the magical fertilization of the sun and time-space. All right, so lives in a kind of ocean, floats in the ocean like a big bathtub, orbited by the moon, who is a sort of a fairy godmother in this cosmology, and we can have more than one. Fertilized by the rays of light originating in the sun, which actually probably originates somewhere else than the sun, and the sun is an expression of this property or potential, excuse me, of originary and fertilizing power. Again, I'm not asking anyone to adopt my cosmology, but this is how I usually prefer to think, unless I am entertaining another perspective for purposes of conversation or exploration. And look, I didn't invent this cosmology. This is a cosmology that was transmitted to me, and this is the reason why I find it compelling, because it wasn't invented by humans. It's a knowledge way that comes from non-humans, and it wasn't explicitly delineated in the way language makes it sound. Rather, it was suggested as a useful perspective to entertain. Right? So is the earth a thing? Well, in language, okay, you can think of it that way. It's going to be unfortunate, the repercussions that'll happen if you believe that it's just an object. But, yeah, in English language, sure. As you approach the direction of conceptual correspondence with the real, the beautiful, or the true, it quickly becomes impossible that the earth is a thing. It becomes quickly impossible that the earth is not at least a being, and probably something transcendental to beings, that produces beings, perhaps as a kind of side effect of its nature, identity, relations, and activity in a multi-layered universe that's quite different from our relatively mechanistic suppositions about time-space. Because in the actual universe, everything is more than merely alive. And we don't have... If there's a concept in English for more than merely alive, I'd love to know what that is. The only word I can easily locate in my vocabulary is transcendental, but that doesn't tell you that it's more than merely alive. And you can say the word spiritual. This just leads to a bunch of confusion, because there's this kind of weird property dualism that arises in the in the sequelae of supposing that there are spirits or souls. And whatever's actually going on doesn't seem property dualistic to me. I can't say what it does seem, primarily because our fucking catalog of categories is missing fundamentally crucial position, like tags. For example, a tag that means more than merely alive, progenerative of beings' life and minds, actively holy, or actively divine, originary. We need some placeholders for these kinds of things, these kinds of qualities, characteristics. But even the idea of characteristics, even the idea of language and its nominata, already inclines us to error. Because the transcendental is beyond abstract reference. That's the problem. If we had a category that implied to us that it was beyond, that the reference in this category are beyond abstract reference, you can see that there's already a problem, because now we're going to refer to them abstractly in language. We think we can encompass them if we just make the right shape of category. Well, what if it's not true? What if there's some things that language just fails to point toward, or misleads us when it does? What if the goal isn't to refer to things, but to actually reacquire the direct experience of original participation, in the sense that Owen Barfield may have meant it, and in the sense that I was implying when I talked about what I strongly suspect happened to ancient peoples when they looked at the sky, or a mountain, or a lake. They didn't see things. They immediately felt the transformation of their consciousness in a transcendental way that lifted them above their mere humanity into direct filial, memorial, and visceral participation. The same way as when you jump into a lake of water, or you slide down an ice sheaf, or you bungee jump, right, into a crevasse. This kind of thing. It is impossible. You can make face noises. You can make face noises about the flavors of food. Will you be able to taste the face noises? No. There might be unusual humans who have forms of sensorial memory, where if I suggest the word strawberry, they begin to taste it. As if the memory of strawberry is in their mouth or something. But not me. You can talk about apples all you like. I will not be able to taste the flavor of apples. Can I be hypnotized or entranced to think I am tasting apples? Possibly. Will I actually taste them? Seems wildly unlikely to me.
Glad we're doing this.
So I suspect that when the ancients looked up at the sky, and I have reason to suspect this not just from thought, not just theorizing, but from my own direct experience, when they looked at the sky, it was like diving into an immediate relationship with the spirit of time-space, origin. And so they did not so much have superstitions, right? Their religions were not superstitious. What their religions were doing, the Egyptians and the Aztecs and people who came before them, what they were doing is they were making images of beings and situations they directly knew participatorially in their relationships with the world, the sky, origin, the sun, the moon, the planets. Much as a solo diver, for example, might represent dolphins, whales, octopuses, coral reefs, shellfish, crayfish, like lobsters, clams, shrimp, cuttlefish, squid, fishes of every kind, sea anemones, sea urchins. When we look at the effusive, what we think of as symbolism of the Egyptians, rather than thinking, oh, they were very inventive, we should think perhaps they're actually telling us something about their direct experience of the features of character and relation they directly encountered in exploring time-space by diving into it participatorially. Just as if they could rise up off the earth, just as if they could fall into the sky. They could dive into the sky the same way we dive into the ocean. And they didn't need spaceships because they had something better. I mean, spaceships really suck. If you got to have those, time-space is terrible for that. They had something better. They had what I would call a traveling body, which I believe we all have. We're just trained not to think so, and not to believe in it, and so forth. And I think the traveling body was naturally awakened in them when they gazed skyward. And so then, from that perspective, they may have understood that Earth was a planet, having looked back upon it from a disembodied traveling perspective. Far above the Earth. So I suspect that humans had seen the Earth from space long before the American astronauts or the Soviet astronauts went up there. And these are some of my thoughts on what is the earth and many related ideas. Again, I'm so grateful for our time together today and the fact that we're all still alive and can attempt meaningful anamnesis about what it means to be human, to be alive, to participate in physical reality, and to think in new and hopefully liberating ways that result in educare rather than merely education. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now. May your way be beautiful.